After 40 years of happy marriage, Margaret comes across a yellowed letter hidden in her husband's study. The contents reveal a shocking truth that rocks her world, hinting at a secret Robert has kept all their lives together. When she confronts him, the truth threatens to destroy everything they have built. Discover how one couple's journey through deception leads to an unexpected revelation that will leave you questioning the extent to which the strongest bonds are unbreakable, or there are situations in life that are insurmountable. Welcome, enjoy, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Margaret hummed softly as she dusted the familiar contours of her husband's study. 40 years of marriage had etched every nook and cranny of their home into her memory. Yet today, something felt different. As her cloth swept across Robert's old oak desk, a yellowed corner peeked out from beneath a stack of papers. Curiosity piqued. Margaret gently tugged at the mysterious fragment, revealing an envelope addressed to her husband in unfamiliar handwriting. The postmark dated back nearly 4 decades, to a time just before they'd met. Her heart quickened as she held the weight of untold secrets in her hands. She stood frozen, the duster forgotten at her side. The afternoon sun streamed through the lace curtains, casting intricate shadows on the hardwood floor. In all their years together, Margaret had never questioned Robert's devotion or their shared history. They'd built a life of trust, laughter, and unwavering support. Yet now, this innocuous envelope threatened to unravel the fabric of their existence. Margaret's fingers trembled as she traced the faded ink, her mind racing with possibilities. Should she open it? Confront Robert? Pretend she never saw it? The distant chime of the grandfather clock in the hallway startled Margaret from her reverie. Robert would be home soon from his golf game. Hastily, she slipped the letter into her apron pocket, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and apprehension. As she resumed her dusting with mechanical movements, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The comfortable routine of their retirement years suddenly felt fragile, like a soap bubble ready to burst at the slightest touch. Margaret made her way downstairs, each step heavy with the weight of her discovery. She entered the kitchen, absently preparing Robert's favorite tea as she had done countless times before. But today, the familiar motions felt foreign, her mind elsewhere. As the kettle whistled, Margaret resolved to confront the truth, whatever it might be. She and Robert had weathered many storms together. Surely they could face this one too. With a deep breath, she steeled herself for the conversation that would either reaffirm their bond or shatter it completely. As Margaret waited for Robert's return, her mind drifted to the early days of their courtship. She smiled, remembering their first meeting at a local diner where she worked as a waitress. Robert, then a young accountant, would come in every day for lunch, always requesting to be seated in her section. His shy smiles and gentle demeanor had won her over, and before long, they were inseparable. Those early years were filled with dreams, laughter, and the excitement of building a life together. They'd faced challenges, of course, but always as a united front. Their wedding day rose vivid in her memory, a small, intimate affair in her parents' backyard. Margaret could almost smell the roses that had adorned every surface and feel the softness of her simple white dress. Robert's eyes had glistened with tears as she walked down the makeshift aisle, and in that moment, she knew she'd made the right choice. They'd promised to love and cherish each other through all of life's ups and downs, a vow they'd renewed silently every day since. The years that followed brought the joy of parenthood, the stress of mortgages, and the bittersweet transitions of life. They'd raised 2 children, weathered financial struggles, and supported each other through the loss of their parents. Through it all, their love had deepened, transforming from the spark of young romance to the steady flame of lifelong companionship. Margaret's heart swelled as she thought of the countless small moments that had knit their lives so tightly together. Shared cups of coffee, whispered conversations late at night, and the comfortable silence of Sunday afternoons. Now, in their golden years, they'd settled into a peaceful routine. Retirement had brought new adventures, traveling, volunteering, and spending precious time with their grandchildren. Robert's golf games and Margaret's book club provided individual pursuits, but they always came back together, sharing the day's events over dinner. It was a good life, a blessed life. And yet, Margaret thought, her hand unconsciously moving to the letter hidden in her apron pocket, had it all been built on a foundation of secrets? The sound of a car in the driveway jolted her back to the present. Robert was home. Margaret's heart raced as she heard Robert's key in the lock. She smoothed her apron, acutely aware of the letter's weight against her hip. The door opened, and Robert's familiar figure appeared, his face lighting up at the sight of her. "Hello, darling," he called out, hanging up his jacket. "How was your day?" The normalcy of his greeting almost made Margaret second-guess herself, but the urgency of her discovery propelled her forward. "Robert," she began, her voice steadier than she felt, "I need to talk to you about something important." Concern flickered across Robert's face as he registered Margaret's serious tone. He followed her into the living room, settling into his favorite armchair while she perched on the edge of the sofa. Margaret took a deep breath, then slowly withdrew the letter from her pocket. "I found this while cleaning your study today," she said, holding it out to him. Robert's eyes widened in recognition, then quickly clouded with an emotion Margaret couldn't quite place. Was it fear? Guilt? "Can you explain this to me, Robert? What secret have you been keeping all these years?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Robert's gaze dropped to his hands, which were clasped tightly in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Margaret, I never meant to keep anything from you. I thought I was protecting you. Protecting us." He looked up, his eyes pleading for understanding. "It's complicated, and I'm not sure where to begin." Margaret felt a mix of emotions surge through her: anger at being kept in the dark, fear of what she was about to learn, and a deep, abiding love for the man before her. "Start at the beginning," Margaret said softly, reaching out to take Robert's hand. Despite her hurt and confusion, the gesture came naturally, a testament to the decades of trust between them. Robert squeezed her hand gratefully, then began to speak. As the story unfolded, Margaret listened with a heavy heart, tears welling in her eyes. The comfortable life they'd built together suddenly felt like a house of cards, teetering on the edge of collapse. Yet even as her world shifted beneath her, a small part of Margaret knew that whatever came next, the love they shared would be their guiding light through the storm. Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the digital clock on her nightstand ticked away the hours. Robert's steady breathing beside her offered little comfort tonight. His revelation echoed in her mind, each detail a fresh wound. A child. A whole other life he'd kept hidden for decades. She turned to look at her husband's sleeping form, wondering how she could have missed the weight of this secret all these years. The man she thought she knew completely now seemed like a stranger. Sleep eluded her as questions swirled relentlessly. Why hadn't he told her sooner? What else might he be hiding? Margaret slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Robert, and padded softly downstairs. In the kitchen, she made herself a cup of chamomile tea, hoping its warmth might soothe her troubled mind. As she sipped, she gazed out the window at the quiet street, the familiarity of their neighborhood offering little solace. The life they'd built together suddenly felt like a beautifully crafted illusion. Dawn broke, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold. Margaret had barely slept, her thoughts a tumultuous sea of emotions. As she heard Robert stirring upstairs, anxiety gripped her. How would they face each other in the harsh light of day? The easy routine they'd perfected over years now felt awkward and forced. When Robert entered the kitchen, the tension between them was palpable. "Good morning," he said softly, his voice laced with uncertainty. Margaret managed a weak smile, but words failed her. Later that morning, Margaret found herself dialing a familiar number. "Hello?" came the cheerful voice of her best friend Sarah. "Sarah, I need to talk," Margaret said, her voice cracking. "Can we meet?" Within an hour, they were seated in a quiet corner of their favorite cafe. As Margaret poured out the story, Sarah listened with compassion, offering a comforting hand and a shoulder to cry on. "Oh, Margaret," she sighed when the tale was told. "What a burden to bear. But remember, love can overcome even the deepest of secrets. Give yourself time to process this." The weight of unspoken words hung heavy in the air as Margaret and Robert sat across from each other at the dinner table. The clinking of cutlery against plates seemed unnaturally loud in the strained silence. Finally, Robert set down his fork and looked up, his eyes filled with remorse. "Margaret," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "I owe you the full truth. I've carried this secret for so long, and I realize now how wrong I was to keep it from you." Margaret nodded, bracing herself for what was to come. Robert took a deep breath and began his tale. "Before I met you, I was in a relationship with a woman named Claire. It was brief but intense. When it ended, I was heartbroken, but I moved on. A few months later, just weeks before I met you, Claire contacted me. She was pregnant." He paused, gauging Margaret's reaction. She sat stone-faced, urging him to continue with a slight nod. "I was shocked, scared. I offered to marry her, to do the right thing, but she refused. She didn't want to trap me, she said. Instead, we agreed that I would provide financial support, but remain uninvolved in the child's life." As Robert's story unfolded, Margaret felt a whirlwind of emotions. Anger at the deception, sympathy for the young man Robert had been, facing such a monumental decision alone. "When I met you," Robert continued, his voice softening, "I fell in love completely. I wanted to tell you about Claire and the baby, but I was afraid. Afraid of losing you. Afraid of disrupting the perfect life we were building. As time passed, it became harder to find the right moment to confess." Tears welled in his eyes. "I've sent money every month for 40 years, but I've never met my child. I thought I was protecting our family, but now I see I was just being a coward." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's mind reeled as she processed the magnitude of Robert's confession. 40 years of monthly payments, of carrying this burden alone. She felt a complex mix of hurt, betrayal, and a strange sense of pride in the man who had shouldered this responsibility for so long. "Why now?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why tell me after all this time?" Robert reached across the table, gently taking her hand. "Because I can't bear the weight of this secret anymore. Because you deserve to know the whole truth about the man you married. And because Claire passed away last month, and her last wish was for me to meet our child." In the days that followed Robert's confession, Margaret found herself lost in memories of their early years together. She remembered the young man she'd fallen in love with, kind, responsible, with a hint of sadness in his eyes that she'd always attributed to the loss of his parents. Now, she realized, that sadness had deeper roots. She thought of the times Robert had seemed distracted or melancholy, especially around the holidays. Had he been thinking of his unknown child during those moments? The Robert she knew now was overlaid with this new information, like a familiar photograph suddenly viewed through a different lens. Margaret sat in their sunroom, flipping through old photo albums. Here was Robert on their wedding day, his smile radiant as he looked at her. There he was holding their firstborn, tears of joy streaming down his face. She paused at a picture of Robert at the hospital after the birth of their second child. His happiness was evident, but now Margaret noticed a flicker of something else in his expression. Was it guilt? She tried to imagine how he must have felt, welcoming his children into the world while knowing another child of his was out there, unknown and unseen. As she delved deeper into the past, Margaret began to understand the complexity of Robert's situation. He'd been young, scared, and suddenly faced with an enormous responsibility. His decision to provide financial support without involvement must have seemed like the best solution at the time. She thought about Claire, this woman she'd never met, raising a child alone while keeping such a monumental secret. Margaret's anger began to soften, replaced by a profound sadness for all the lives affected by this long-held secret. The sound of the back door opening startled Margaret from her reverie. Robert entered, returning from a solitary walk. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Margaret saw not just her husband of 40 years, but also the young man he'd been, overwhelmed, making difficult choices that would echo through the decades. "Robert," she said softly, "tell me about Claire. Tell me about the time before we met." He sat beside her, relief evident in his face at her willingness to listen. As he began to speak, Margaret realized that understanding the past was the first step towards deciding their future. Margaret sat in her favorite armchair, a cup of tea cooling beside her as she gazed out the window. The past week had been a whirlwind of emotions, anger, betrayal, confusion, and a deep, aching sadness. She'd alternated between wanting to comfort Robert and needing space to process her own feelings. Now, as the initial shock began to subside, Margaret found herself facing a crucial decision. Robert's child, their child in a way, was out there, waiting to meet the father they'd never known. The question that loomed large in Margaret's mind was, what role, if any, did she want to play in this unfolding drama? She thought about the life she and Robert had built together, the family they'd raised. Their children, now adults with families of their own, were blissfully unaware of the turmoil their parents were experiencing. How would they react to the news of a half-sibling? Margaret's heart ached at the thought of disrupting their lives. Yet, a small voice inside her whispered that perhaps this new connection could bring unexpected joy and richness to their family. She'd always believed in the power of love to heal and unite. Could that belief extend to this unprecedented situation? As the afternoon light began to fade, Margaret made her decision. She would meet Robert's child, not just for Robert's sake, or for the sake of this unknown person who shared her husband's blood, but for herself. She needed to see, to understand, to make this abstract concept real. With trembling hands, she reached for the phone and dialed Robert's number at work. "Robert," she said when he answered, her voice steadier than she felt. "I think it's time we arrange that meeting. Together." The relief in Robert's voice was palpable, and Margaret felt a glimmer of hope that they might navigate this challenge as they had so many others, side by side. That evening, as they sat together planning the meeting, Margaret felt a mix of anxiety and anticipation. "What's their name?" she asked softly, realizing she didn't even know this basic detail about the person who had been a shadow in their lives for so long. "Elizabeth," Robert replied, a small smile playing on his lips. Claire named her Elizabeth. The name hung in the air between them, suddenly making everything more real. As they discussed the logistics of the meeting, Margaret found herself wondering about Elizabeth. What kind of person had she become? Would there be glimpses of Robert in her face, her mannerisms? With each passing moment, Margaret's resolve strengthened. Whatever happened next, they would face it as a family. The cafe buzzed with the gentle hum of conversation and the clinking of cups, but Margaret barely registered the ambient noise. Her focus was entirely on the door, watching for the arrival that would change their lives forever. Robert sat beside her, his hand clasped tightly in hers, both drawing and offering strength. They had arrived early, wanting to compose themselves before the meeting. As the minutes ticked by, Margaret's heart raced. She found herself scrutinizing every woman who entered, wondering, is that her? Could that be Elizabeth? Suddenly, Robert's grip on her hand tightened. Margaret followed his gaze to see a woman in her late 30s entering the cafe. There was no mistaking the resemblance. She had Robert's eyes and the same gentle curve of his smile. Elizabeth scanned the room, her expression a mix of nervousness and anticipation. When her eyes landed on Robert, a flash of recognition passed between them. Margaret felt a complex surge of emotions, sympathy for this woman who had grown up without a father, a twinge of jealousy at the unmistakable connection she saw, and a deep, unexpected desire to welcome her. As Elizabeth approached their table, Margaret stood alongside Robert. "Elizabeth," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm Robert, and this is my wife, Margaret." Elizabeth nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. It's good to finally meet you," she managed to say. An awkward moment passed before Margaret, drawing on years of experience as a hostess, gently guided them to sit. As they settled in, the initial tension began to ease. They ordered coffee, the familiar ritual providing a momentary respite from the emotional weight of the situation. Conversation flowed hesitantly at first, but soon gained momentum. Elizabeth shared stories of her childhood, of Claire, and of her own family, a husband and 2 young children. Margaret found herself captivated by this woman who was both stranger and family. She saw echoes of Robert in Elizabeth's mannerisms, in the way she gestured as she spoke. As the meeting progressed, Margaret felt a gradual shift within herself. The abstract concept of Robert's secret child was transforming into a real person, complex, vulnerable, and seeking connection. By the time they said their goodbyes, with promises to meet again soon, Margaret realized that her family hadn't been diminished by this revelation, but rather had grown in an unexpected and beautiful way. The drive home from the cafe was quiet, both Margaret and Robert lost in their thoughts. The meeting with Elizabeth had been intense, emotional, and surprisingly healing. As they pulled into their driveway, Margaret turned to Robert. "She has your laugh," she said softly. Robert nodded, a mix of joy and regret playing across his features. "I've missed so much," he whispered. Margaret reached out and squeezed his hand, a gesture of understanding and forgiveness. As they entered their home, the familiar surroundings seemed somewhat changed, as if the axis of their world had shifted slightly. That night, sleep eluded Margaret once again, but this time her thoughts were not fraught with anger or confusion. Instead, she found herself reflecting on the nature of family and forgiveness. She thought about Elizabeth, about the life she had lived parallel to theirs, always connected yet separate. Margaret marveled at the resilience of the human heart, its capacity to expand and embrace new love, even in the face of past hurts. She thought about Claire, the woman who had borne the weight of this secret alongside Robert, and felt a surprising kinship with her. As dawn broke, Margaret made her way to the kitchen, cradling a cup of tea. She sat at the table where, just days ago, her world had been turned upside down by Robert's confession. Now, she saw that table as a symbol of their enduring relationship, a place where truths were shared, hurts were healed, and love was reaffirmed. Robert joined her, his presence both familiar and somehow new. "What are you thinking?" he asked gently. Margaret considered for a moment before responding. "I'm thinking about second chances, about how it's never too late to right a wrong or to open our hearts." They spent the morning talking, really talking, in a way they hadn't in years. They discussed their fears, their hopes, and their vision for the future, a future that now included Elizabeth and her family. As they talked, Margaret felt the last vestiges of resentment melting away, replaced by a deeper understanding of the man she had loved for over 4 decades. She saw now that Robert's secret hadn't diminished their life together. Rather, it had been a heavy burden he'd carried out of misguided love and protection. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Margaret and Robert made plans to tell their children about their new sister, plans for family gatherings that would now include new faces, plans for a future that was at once familiar and excitingly different. The following weeks were a delicate dance of emotions and adjustments for Margaret and Robert. They had agreed to take things slowly, allowing everyone time to process the monumental changes in their family dynamic. Margaret found herself oscillating between moments of acceptance and flashes of residual hurt. One afternoon, as she was tending to her garden, a task that had always brought her peace, she felt a sudden wave of sadness wash over her. The realization that Robert had carried this secret throughout their entire marriage still stung, despite her rational understanding of his motivations. Robert, sensing her inner turmoil, made consistent efforts to rebuild the trust between them. He began leaving little notes for her around the house, reminiscent of their early courtship days. Each note expressed his love, gratitude, and remorse. "Thank you for your strength," one read. "Your capacity for forgiveness humbles me," said another. These small gestures, coupled with his unwavering patience as Margaret worked through her feelings, gradually began to heal the fractures in their relationship. They started having long talks in the evenings, not just about Elizabeth in the past, but about their hopes and fears for the future. As they navigated this new chapter in their lives, Margaret and Robert also faced the challenge of integrating Elizabeth into their family. They decided to host a small dinner, inviting Elizabeth, her husband, and their children. The evening was filled with a mix of awkwardness and warmth, laughter and tears. Margaret watched as Robert interacted with his grandchildren for the first time, his eyes shining with a joy that tugged at her heart. She found herself drawn to Elizabeth's children, these young ones who were suddenly part of her family tree. By the end of the evening, as they waved goodbye to their guests, Margaret felt a sense of peace settle over her. She turned to Robert, seeing the mixture of happiness and uncertainty in his eyes. "It's going to be okay," she said softly, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. Robert pulled her into an embrace, and they stood there in the doorway, holding each other. In that moment, Margaret knew that while the path to complete forgiveness might be long, they were firmly on it together. The future, once clouded by secrets, now held the promise of new connections and deeper understanding. As summer faded into autumn, Margaret and Robert found themselves settling into a new rhythm of life. The initial shock of Robert's revelation had given way to a period of growth and reconnection, not just with Elizabeth and her family, but with each other. They had made the decision to be open with their other children about Elizabeth, a conversation that had been difficult, but ultimately strengthening for the family. While there had been initial hurt and confusion, their children had shown remarkable understanding and a willingness to embrace their new sister and her family. Margaret discovered an unexpected joy in her growing relationship with Elizabeth. They began meeting for coffee regularly, sometimes with Robert, sometimes just the two of them. During these meetings, Margaret learned about Elizabeth's life, her career as a teacher, her passion for painting, her struggles and triumphs as a mother. She found herself sharing stories of Robert's younger years, filling in the blanks of a history Elizabeth had never known. There were moments of sadness, of course, acknowledgments of the time lost, but these were overshadowed by the genuine connection forming between them. One crisp Saturday morning, as Margaret and Robert prepared for a family picnic that would bring together all their children and grandchildren for the first time, Margaret paused in her preparations. She watched Robert carefully packing a basket with Elizabeth's favorite fruits, a detail he had eagerly learned and remembered. The sight filled her with a complex emotion, a mixture of lingering pain at the years of secrecy, pride in the man Robert was striving to be now, and a deep, abiding love that had weathered this storm and emerged stronger. As they drove to the park, Margaret reflected on the journey of the past few months. The path hadn't been easy, and there were still moments of doubt and hurt. But there was also a newfound depth to their relationship, a hard-earned wisdom that comes from facing difficult truths together. She reached over and took Robert's hand, a gesture that had become more frequent and more meaningful in recent weeks. As they pulled into the parking lot, seeing their entire family, old and new members alike, gathered and waiting, Margaret felt a surge of gratitude. This, she realized, was the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, one filled with the promise of deeper connections and richer experiences. The golden hues of late afternoon sunlight filtered through the windows of Margaret and Robert's home, casting a warm glow over the gathering. It was Thanksgiving, and for the first time, their expanded family was all together under one roof. The house buzzed with the cheerful chaos of multiple generations, children's laughter mingling with adult conversations, the clinking of dishes, and the aroma of a feast in the making. Margaret stood in the doorway of the living room, taking in the scene before her. Robert sat in his favorite armchair, surrounded by grandchildren, both those he had known all their lives, and the newer additions he was getting to know. The sight brought tears to Margaret's eyes, happy tears that spoke of healing and new beginnings. Elizabeth approached Margaret, a glass of wine in hand. "Need any help in the kitchen?" she offered with a smile. Margaret nodded gratefully, and together they made their way through the bustling house. As they worked side by side, preparing the final touches for dinner, Margaret marveled at the ease that had developed between them. There was a comfortable silence, broken occasionally by shared laughs or gentle teasing. In these moments, Margaret felt the last vestiges of resentment melt away, replaced by a genuine affection for this woman who had become not just her husband's daughter, but a dear friend. As the family gathered around the expanded dining table, Margaret took her place beside Robert. Before the meal began, Robert stood, gently tapping his glass for attention. "I'd like to say a few words," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "This past year has been one of revelations and reconciliations. I stand here today, overwhelmed with gratitude." His eyes met Margaret's, filled with love and remorse. "To my wife, Margaret, whose strength and capacity for forgiveness continue to humble me. Thank you for standing by me, for opening your heart to expand our family." He then turned to Elizabeth. "And to Elizabeth, thank you for your grace and understanding, for allowing me into your life after so many years." As Robert's heartfelt speech concluded, Margaret looked around the table. She saw tears in many eyes, but also smiles and nods of agreement. This gathering was more than just a holiday meal. It was a celebration of love's triumph over secrets and time. As the evening progressed, filled with shared stories, laughter, and the forging of new bonds, Margaret felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The path to this moment had been challenging, filled with hurt and difficult conversations. But as she watched her family, old and new members alike, interact with genuine warmth and affection, she knew that every step had been worth it. Love, in all its complex and forgiving glory, had indeed triumphed. I really hope you enjoyed the story. Please leave a comment with your views. I'm sure there will be new videos on this channel that will thrill you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss our next videos. Until next time.